Released in 1989, but set 3 decades prior in 1959, Dead Poets Society follows a group of young men studying in an elite preparatory boarding school somewhere in New England. With the strict traditionalist guidance and teachings of the school, the boys of Welton Academy are expected to follow the narrow meritocratic path laid ahead of them by their parents and their teachers, which is to succeed in their studies at Welton, go on to pursue college in the Ivy League, and become doctors, bankers, and lawyers, ultimately returning to the aristocracy they were born into, but now as productive members of society. Conditioned to follow the high standards inculcated into them, it's unimaginable for the boys to second-guess their purpose in life. That is, until the arrival of Mr. Keating, the new English professor, who throughout the movie will inspire the boys to question the conformism indoctrinated into them and think for themselves. Shy and self-doubting, Todd Anderson, who is a new student at Welton, is living in the shadows of his parents' and teachers' expectations of him that he will follow in his brother's footsteps, a Welton graduate himself, and go to Yale to become a lawyer. Neil Perry, Todd's bright and charismatic new roommate, is under similar parental pressure with his overbearing father's rigid expectation of him to become a doctor. However, the boys find a safe space when Neil gets the idea to resurrect a club that Mr. Keating belonged to during his days at Welton, the Dead Poets Society, a secret club that involves clandestine meetings in a cavern in the woods at night, where the members read, recite, and analyze poetry together. The movie is amongst many things a portrayal of adolescence. The boys' search for identity and the looming transition from boyhood to manhood that it implies is a central theme in the film. And one thing I love about the movie is how it depicts boyhood in such a delicate fashion. It goes against the archetypal, stoic, tough, emotionless male tropes that had been so prevalent in Western media up until that point, especially in male-centric media. And I would even go as far as saying that Dead Poets Society redefines masculinity in the modern age. It conveys the importance of vulnerability to masculinity, two concepts that were typically contradictory to each other, as we see the boys sharing their feelings, fears, and dreams, straying from their heteronormative gender roles, and embracing a gentler, nonetheless as strong, masculinity. Which is a great segue into transcendentalism, a philosophy that Mr. Keating ingrains in his students. Transcendentalism, a literary philosophical movement that originated in 1820s New England, was actually one of the first currents of American philosophy, with its core belief being that people and nature are inherently good, but can be corrupted by society and its institutions. Conversely, transcendentalists promote the importance of self-reliance, independence of thought, intuition, and critical thinking, as opposed to external authority, blind conformity, and empiricism. As you might have noticed, many of the pillars of transcendentalism are woven into the film, especially through Mr. Keating encouraging the boys to be free thinkers and nonconformists, thereby going against the institutional values of the school. And though the film illustrated the splendors of the philosophy, it also portrayed the downfalls that can be associated with being transcendentalist in a traditionalist setting. For example, when Charlie impulsively exposes the existence of the Dead Poets Society to the school officials, and all of the boys are punished. Or similarly, when the school officials learn of Mr. Keating's teaching style, and they fire him from his position. Another character who displayed the potential dangers of transcendentalism is Neil. Neil started straying from his conformist father's idea of success, and began acting despite his father's objections. Sadly, this created an irreconcilable disagreement between the two, a catalyst to Neil tragically taking his own life. And looking for a fall guy, the school administration blames Neil's death on Mr. Keating's unorthodox teaching methods, blaming Mr. Keating's teachings for Neil's suicide. Transcendentalism is often associated with romanticism, which is another movement that is very present in the film. Romanticism is an artistic and intellectual movement that peaked in the beginning to mid-19th century Europe and places a big emphasis on emotions, art, and nature. Some scholars believe that the movement originated as a response to the Industrial Revolution and the kind of rigidity, dullness, and urbanization that it brought with it. Consequently, the Romantics expressed themselves through the visual arts, music, literature, and poetry, and wanted to evoke emotions by creating beauty. Romanticism emphasized that artists and thinkers should not only have the freedom, but should be celebrated for their individuality, authenticity, and uniqueness, as opposed to simply following the strictness of what we consider as classic art. Hence why the movement, along with transcendentalism, are both often linked with individualism. Romanticism also became prevalent in European political philosophy, apparently inspiring the rise of nationalism. But to be honest, I don't know a lot about 19th century European politics, and it's not very relevant to the film, so we're just gonna move on. Going back to the movie, we can see that Mr. Keating's personal philosophy blends transcendentalism and romanticism. He even mentions being a romantic a couple of times in the film, most famously saying, one of the main themes in the movie is the struggle between conformity and non-conformity. Faced with societal norms, parental expectation, gender roles, and the strict Welton administration, we see the main characters kind of rebelling against the external pressures exerted onto them. Some of this rebellion comes in the form of what we would consider as typical teenage disobedience, like drinking, smoking, and sneaking out. But there's also a sort of more visceral rebellion against conformity. Mr. Keating instills in his students the love of poetry. In the movie, poetry is symbolic of tenderness, of beauty, gentleness, and vulnerability. All emotions who, especially in the 1950s, did not fit into the hegemonic masculinity that was indoctrinated into boys. Mr. Keating is a very important figure in this story because he kind of represents the challenge to these traditional conceptions, promoting individuality over conformism. He creates a safe space where the boys can freely express themselves with vulnerability, and he encourages his pupils to kind of disregard social norms and more so embrace their passions. I think by now you can kind of begin to understand why this movie is so beloved in queer circles. And on that subject, I, along with many others, believe that there is queer subtext in this movie, particularly when it relates to Neil and Todd's characters. Of course, interpretations of arts are never universal, and it's up to the viewer to decide, so you don't have to agree, but many have theorized that Neil and Todd love each other. Which kind of love that is, it's up to you to decide, but I, along with many, would argue that it is romantic love. And again, you don't have to agree. That's what's so great about it. Good art invokes different emotion in each viewer, and I don't think any particular interpretation can be completely invalidated. First of all, Neil's longing to be an actor has been greatly speculated to be a metaphor for his queerness. Of course, not because acting is inherently gay, but because it represents Neil breaking away from his patriarchal father's rigid and traditionalist expectations of him, which are to become a doctor, choosing a life that his father, his school, all of his upbringing heartily disapprove of, opting for self-expression over adherence to norms. This experience is one that many queer people go through, which is one of the reasons why a lot of us view Neil's story as a queer story. In one emotional scene in the film, Neil opens up to Mr. Keating about his father's disapproval of him becoming an actor, to which Mr. Keating tells him, "You're acting for him too. You're playing the part of the dutiful son. I know this sounds impossible, but you have to talk to him. You have to show him who you are, what your heart is." To which Neil replies, "I'm trapped," with tears in his eyes. Yes, the scene is superficially about Neil's longing to be an actor, but there is undoubtedly more depth to it than that. I'm not the first to infer that Mr. Keating and Neil might be alluding to the fact that Neil is queer. During my research for this video, I came across a publication from the online publication Collider entitled "Dead Poet Society Shines Brighter Through a Queer Lens." It's really interesting, and I'll put the link in the description box if you'd ever like to read it. But I'll read to you a passage from the article where the author analyzes the whole acting as queerness metaphor. Neil becomes his truest self over the course of the film, and when that truth is discovered by his parents, they reject it outright. This could easily be swapped out for Neil being gay. He comes to accept what he wants in the safety of the community he has created, but that space is destroyed when his parents discover his identity. Even though his father forbid him to act in the play, Neil defies his father's order and plays the role of Puck in the school's production of A Midsummer's Night Dream. And when he's on stage, you really see him shine. He's happy, he's expressing himself, his friends are cheering him on, and he is really good. But when he spots his father in the crowd, looking threatening and disapproving, you can imagine the fear that Neil experiences. But he finishes the play anyways, and when it ends, everyone cheers for him, but his father grabs him and escorts him out of the theater and to their house, where one of the most climactic scenes of the movie take place. Neil's father asks Neil why he insists on defying him. He tells Neil that he won't let him ruin his life, and that he is taking him out of Welton and sending him to military school the first thing in the morning. Which, I'm sorry, but this is a very inordinately weighty reaction. Sending your son to military school simply because he acted in a Shakespearean play. This is another reason why a lot of people believe that their fight might be subtextually about Neil's father not accepting his son to be queer. Neil's dad is saying all of this, and Neil gets a little burst of courage, but ultimately he freezes, unable to express himself to his father, knowing that he cannot win this fight. Completely hopeless, he sits back down and his parents go to bed. Now that we've talked about Neil, I'd like to take a moment to talk about Todd. He's personally my favorite character of the movie, and I personally believe that even though he doesn't have the most screen time or the most lines, his evolution as a person throughout the movie is the most central character development of the story. I rewatched Dead Poets Society recently as preparation for this video, and I noted down a few scenes that I think illustrate Todd's character development. And there are 3 scenes in particular that I would like to analyze with you. The first scene is the one where Mr. Keating asks the class to write original poems, and knowing that Todd is shy about speaking in front of people, he brings him to the front of the class. Mr. Keating writes a quote from a Walt Whitman poem on the blackboard that reads, "I sound my barbaric yap over the roofs of the world," before bringing Todd to the front of the class and making him yap loudly. Mr. Keating then points to a picture of Whitman and asks Todd what he reminds him of, to which Todd answers, "A madman." Todd proceeds to improvise a poem on the spot, which I'll read to you. I close my eyes and his image floats beside me. A sweaty-toothed madman with a stare that pounds my brain. His hands reach out and choke me, and all the time he's mumbling truth, like a blanket that always leaves your feet cold. You pull it, stretch it, it will never be enough. You can kick it, beat it, it will never cover any of us. From the moment we enter crying to the moment we leave dying, it will just cover your face, as you wail and cry and scream. I was watching Alexander Avila's video on Dead Poets Society. I'll link it in the description. I really recommend watching it if you haven't already. And I was reading the comments, and I saw a comment that analyzed Todd's poem. I thought that their point of view was really interesting, and I wanted to share it with you. So the commenter said, and I quote, "To me, I interpret this as Todd being afraid of his queer identity. He sees Walt Whitman, a very well-known queer man, as intimidating. I think this is his way of saying he finds embracing the fact that he is queer scary. The madman chokes him and stands at his side, forcing Todd to confront him. But Todd doesn't want to confront him because he knows it will only bring him pain." I thought that was really interesting, and it also made me think of how much the movie places an emphasis on Walt Whitman, especially in relation to Todd. I did some research, and apparently the quote that Mr. Keating wrote on his blackboard is a quote from a Whitman poem called Song of Myself, a poem that is apparently an ode to individuality and originality, which are 2 things that Todd struggles with. Song of Myself contrasts transcendentalism with realism, which, again, this is so applicable to Todd's character. His heart wants to be transcendentalist, embrace his individuality and be confidently himself, but his head tells him that he needs to be a realist and conform. Now, I might be reading too much into this, but I think that Mr. Keating might have chosen this poem intentionally for Todd. And I encourage you to read some analysis of Song of Myself online because I think that it's very relevant to Todd's character. Also, I think that Todd's poetry reading is a defining moment in the film. Todd isn't a character that expresses his feelings a lot. In the first half of the movie, he mostly seems to suppress his emotions in an attempt to blend in and float through unnoticed. But through this improvised poem, it's kind of the first time that we see Todd conveying his emotions that maybe even himself was unconsciously aware of. His feelings of being suffocated by the conformity around him, of suppressing his true identity. Moreover, in the poem, the blanket is a metaphor for truth, and I don't know enough about poetry analysis to feel apt to analyze what that metaphor means, but I suspect that there might be a deeper meaning about that. Anyways, let me know what you think about Todd's poem in the comments, because I think that it kind of acts as the catalyst for the growth that he will experience in the second half of the movie, and kind of marks the beginning of his character development. Also, I know I'm not the only one to have noticed how Neil looks at Todd after the poetry reading. The second Todd scene I'd like to analyze is the one where he learns of Neil's death. Todd is sleeping, and he is awoken by the boys of the Dead Poets Society, gathered around him with deep sadness and concern in their eyes, and reluctantly, Charlie tells Todd the tragic news. The scene cuts, and the boys are now outside in the snow. Todd seems to have a moment of denial, looking at the snow falling and saying, "It's so beautiful," which is followed by him throwing up and breaking down. The boys gather around the sobbing Todd in an effort to console him, to no avail, and Todd breaks free from them and runs in the snow, stumbling and screaming Neil's name. I interpret Todd's reaction to Neil's death as an indication that he cared for him more than a friend. Of course, everyone deals with grief differently, but when you think of it, all of the boys were friends with Neil too, and all of them actually knew Neil for way longer than Todd did. However, none had as an intense reaction as Todd did. Also, I think there's something to be said about the fact that all of the boys were so concerned about Todd's reaction that they all went together to tell him the news, gathering around him, comforting him, as if they anticipated that he'd be the most affected by the news. The last thought scene that I wanted to analyze is, of course, the final and probably the most famous scene of the movie. The scene takes place after Mr. Keating has been fired from his position, with Mr. Nolan being his temporary replacement in English class. Now, Mr. Nolan contrasts Mr. Keating in every way. He's the epitome of the patriarchal, traditionalist, intimidating authority figure. So Mr. Keating comes into class to get his belongings, and we see that Todd is ridden with guilt for having signed a letter blaming Mr. Keating for Neil's death, and filled with grief for not only losing Neil, but now his favorite teacher too. And watching Mr. Keating leave, Todd just explodes. Even though Todd is reprimanded by Mr. Nolan, he gets back up and stands upon his desk, uttering the famous "Oh Captain, my Captain," with the other students following his lead. This touching act of defiance and loyalty, a testament to the imprint that Mr. Keating has made on their lives, and kind of unveiling Todd's transformation from a self-doubting, timid boy to a now confident leader. I was looking online to see what people thought about Dead Poet Society having queer subtext, and though a lot of people agreed that they sensed some queer subliminal messaging, others vehemently disagreed. I came across an online magazine that did an article on Dead Poet Society and masculinity, and I would like to analyze something that the author wrote. The author in question said, and I quote, "Dead Poet Society is often portrayed as an allegory for homosexual acceptance, despite it including no openly gay characters or even subtle homosexual behavior. The trouble with this idea is that it implies boys sharing poetry, acting in Shakespearean plays, and expressing emotion must be gay. Instead, this film needs to be held up as one example of the importance of male expression, regardless of sexual orientation." Now, I agree and disagree with different aspects of this comment. First of all, not even subtle homosexual behavior, okay. Secondly, the commenter says that Dead Poet Society isn't an allegory for homosexuality since it doesn't overtly display queer behavior. Now, I'm gonna be picky and say that I don't personally agree with this statement for two reasons. First of all, an allegory is a subtle representation, and allegoric references are supposed to be subtle but not invisible. Allegories cannot be obvious or in your face, or else they wouldn't be allegories. The fact that this story doesn't display explicit queerness in the obvious, "oh, here are two people of the same gender kissing," doesn't mean that the story doesn't have queer subtext. Considering the fact that the movie was released in 1989, it probably wouldn't have been as successfully received if the movie had been overtly queer. And when we remember that the story takes place in 1959, it makes sense that the subtext is more subtle. Furthermore, the commenter says that there is trouble with this idea that implies boys sharing poetry, acting in Shakespearean plays, and expressing emotion must be gay. Now, I agree with a part of what that person is saying. We shouldn't imply that being artistic and expressing emotion is inherently gay, but that's not what we're saying in the slightest. We're not saying that all of the boys in Dead Poet Society are automatically gay because they read poetry. We are interpreting the subtext and analyzing that in Neil and Todd's particular cases, their experience and struggles greatly mirror what we go through as queer people. And finally, I totally agree that the film needs to be held up as one of the best examples of the importance of male expression, regardless of sexual orientation. Now, I was a bit curious, and I did some research to see if any of the actors of Dead Poet Society had ever said anything about the queer subtext interpretation of the movie. And I actually found that two of the actors had commented on it. Firstly, when Robert Samuel Leonard, who played Neil, was asked what he thought about it, he said, and I quote, "I've always seen the validity in it," meaning the queer subtext, "but it's complicated subject matter. It's a bigger subject. It's a boy who falls in love with something impossible to attain. You can watch it and have it affect you, as we all have our struggles. To me, it's all the same. It's just love." Moreover, Gail Hansen, who is the actor that played Charlie, is very active on Twitter, and when he was asked if he thought that Neil and Todd were a couple, this is what he responded. Also, I wanted to include this because I thought it was really funny, but someone on Twitter once asked him how he felt about the influx of gay kids in your mentions asking about a movie you did 30 years ago, and he replied this, which I think is pretty funny. Well, this is pretty much today's video. Thank you very much for spending this time with me. I really hope you enjoyed. And please let me know your thoughts about all of the Dead Poet Society queer subtext thing in the comments. I'd love to read them. And maybe subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this from me in the future. But anyway, thank you again, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye! Mr. Keating writes a quote from a Walt Whitman poem on the blackboard that reads, "I sound my barbaric, I sound my barbaric rap, that reads, I sound my barbaric, I sound my barbaric rap, wap, yup, I sound my barbaric wap, yup, I sound my barbaric yap over the roofs of the world.